The first thing they noticed was how still everything had become. No wind. No movement. No sound. It was as if the world had been paused, but they were the only ones who hadn't gotten the message. Across the wide plain, long grasses that should have been swaying in the evening breeze stood frozen. Above, the clouds hung like bruises smeared across a purple-gray sky. Even the birds had gone silent, as if they too had sensed it, the tearing open of something old and angry and unseen. Kara tightened her grip on the frayed strap of her pack and glanced sideways at Drew. His jaw was set, eyes locked ahead, pretending he didn't notice. Pretending this was just another abandoned stretch of ground in a world full of abandoned places. But it wasn't. They both knew it. They were days out from the nearest settlement, deeper into the uncharted waste than anyone sane ever dared to go. They were chasing rumors. Stories whispered by traders in cracked cafes and crumbling outposts. Stories of voices heard in the dark, of people who went missing but weren't exactly missing, because sometimes you saw them again. Sometimes they came back. Only they weren't the same. Kara hated how quiet Drew had gotten the last 2 days. He used to joke. Talk about how if they found anything they'd get rich, maybe even famous. Now he barely spoke. Like even breathing too loud might wake something up. The sun was sinking fast behind a distant line of jagged hills. Shadows thickened around the two of them, making the open plain feel like a trap closing in. They had maybe an hour, 2 if they pushed it, to find shelter before full night fell. Neither of them wanted to be out here when it got dark. The map was no help. Half of it was guesswork anyway, hand-drawn from scraps of older maps and stitched together with hope. Drew unfolded it again with stiff fingers, muttering under his breath. "There's supposed to be a station," he said, voice low. "Old survey outpost just north of that ridge. If it's still standing." "If," Kara repeated bitterly. She forced herself to move, even though every bone in her body was screaming to stay still, to not draw attention. "Then let's go." The ground felt wrong underfoot, too soft and too brittle at the same time. Their boots crunched through the dried surface layer into something that gave a little, like stepping on paper stretched over water. Every step made Kara's skin crawl. Something was watching them. She didn't know how she knew. There was no sound, no flicker of movement out of the corner of her eye. But she knew it the way a hunted animal knows it's not alone in the forest anymore. By the time they reached the ridge, the last of the light was bleeding out of the sky, staining the world in deep, shadowy blues and endless gray. The outpost, if it existed, had better be close. Drew clambered up first, hauling himself onto the broken rise. He reached down and pulled Kara up after him. They both stood there, catching their breath, staring out over the other side. And there it was. Half buried in the dirt and swallowed by time, the station leaned drunkenly against the slope like a wounded animal. Rusted panels hung from its sides. A single tower, cracked and listing, still reached for the dead sky like it remembered when it had meant something. Kara let out a shaky breath. Shelter. Maybe even answers. They scrambled down the ridge as fast as they dared. The ground here was even worse, slick, almost slimy, as if something under the surface was breathing. Kara slipped once, nearly falling, but Drew caught her arm. Neither of them spoke. At the base of the station the air smelled wrong, too sweet, too thick, like something rotting behind a locked door. Drew pulled a face but said nothing. Kara tried not to breathe through her nose. The main door was hanging crooked on its hinges as if someone, or something, had torn it half off. They edged inside, flashlights slicing thin beams through the dark. The inside was worse. Walls coated in some kind of black residue. Equipment smashed. Floors buckled and cracked like the surface outside. Here and there bones peeked out from the wreckage. Some human, some not. Kara swallowed hard. What the hell happened here? Drew shook his head, but he was staring at something on the far wall. Kara followed his gaze and felt the world tilt sideways. A message scrawled in something dark and flaking. Written in large, frantic strokes. "We are not alone." Underneath, smaller writing, almost an afterthought. "And we are not who we think we are." The flashlight shook in Kara's hand. She gripped it tighter, trying to force the tremor out of her fingers. Drew stepped closer to the wall, reading the words over and over, as if hoping they would somehow make more sense the second or third time around. They didn't. A sudden clatter echoed from somewhere deep in the station. Kara whipped around, heart hammering so hard she thought it might break her ribs. Drew raised his flashlight, casting a jittery circle of light down the hallway. "Probably just something falling," he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Another sound, a dragging noise, soft but steady, followed a few seconds later. Coming closer. They should have run. Every instinct Kara had was screaming at her to run. But something rooted them both to the spot. A terrible, stupid curiosity. Drew moved first, following the sound toward the hallway. Kara, against all better judgment, followed. The hallway was a nightmare. Walls buckling inward, floor sagging under their weight. Flashlights caught glimpses of broken equipment, shredded wires, stains that looked far too fresh. And at the end of the hall, something moved. A figure, hunched and shambling, dragging one foot behind it. Clothes tattered and blackened. Face hidden by a mass of tangled hair. "Hey!" Drew called before Kara could stop him. "Hey, are you okay?" The figure froze. Then, slowly, almost too slowly to be real, it turned toward them. The face that looked back wasn't right. It had all the pieces, eyes, nose, mouth, but they were wrong somehow, shifted and stretched like a mask left too long in the sun. The eyes especially. Too large. Too dark. And burning with a hunger that had nothing human left in it. Kara grabbed Drew's arm, yanking him backward. "Run," she whispered, but the word barely made it out of her throat. The thing took a step toward them. Then another, faster. And then it was charging. They ran. Blind and stumbling, they tore back through the station, slamming into walls, tripping over debris. Kara could hear it behind them, a wet, awful sound like flesh slapping against metal. They burst out into the open, into the last scraps of twilight. The plain stretched out before them, endless and empty. Drew pulled Kara toward the ridge, toward higher ground. They scrambled up the slope, slipping and sliding on the treacherous surface. At the top they didn't stop. They kept running, not daring to look back. But Kara knew that thing was still coming. They didn't stop until their lungs were on fire and their legs buckled under them. They collapsed in the grass, gasping, staring wildly into the growing darkness. For a few heartbeats, the only sound was their own ragged breathing. Then from behind them a new sound rose up. A chorus of voices. Hundreds, maybe thousands. Whispering. Laughing. Crying. Calling. And somewhere in that awful noise, Kara heard her own voice. Calling back to her. Drew grabbed her arm, his eyes wide and full of terror. "Kara," he said, voice breaking, "it's not just one. It's all of them. It's us." She didn't understand. Couldn't understand. Until the whispers grew louder. Until she realized they weren't just behind them anymore. They were inside them. Something had followed them out. Something that wore familiar faces. Something that remembered what it meant to be human, but wasn't human anymore. The plain around them shimmered, as if reality itself was breathing in and out. Kara clutched Drew's hand, holding on as tight as she could. But she could already feel herself slipping. Changing. Becoming something else. Something from the other side of them. Kara didn't know how long they sat there, clinging to each other, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The whispers never stopped. They circled them like a slow, rising tide. Sometimes the voices sounded like strangers. Sometimes they sounded like people Kara used to know. Once, she even heard her mother's voice, soft and broken, calling her name the way she used to when Kara was little and afraid of the dark. Drew finally pulled away first, though it clearly took everything he had. His face looked pale and drawn in the half-light, the skin stretched too tight over his bones. "We can't stay here," he said hoarsely. Kara opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came out. She just nodded. They forced themselves to their feet, muscles screaming in protest. Every step felt heavier now, like the earth was trying to pull them back down, like it wanted them to stay and become part of it. The sky had darkened into something even the stars didn't want to touch. A heavy, oppressive black that swallowed light whole. Kara kept her flashlight trained low, careful not to sweep it too far ahead. Part of her was afraid of what she might see. Drew checked the map again with shaking hands. It was useless now, just a flimsy sheet of lies. But they needed a direction, something to keep them moving. "There's a river a few miles east," he muttered, voice so quiet Kara barely heard him. "If we can find it, maybe we can follow it back to the old highways." He didn't sound sure. But it was the only plan they had. They started walking east, toward the rising hum of the unseen river, trying not to think about the fact that the voices were following them. Or that sometimes they didn't seem to be coming from behind anymore. Sometimes they sounded like they were ahead, waiting. Kara thought about the outpost. The wreckage. The message smeared on the wall. "We are not who we think we are." What did it mean? She kept replaying it over and over in her head, trying to make it fit with what they'd seen, what they were feeling now. But the pieces didn't fit. They were missing too much. They walked for what felt like hours. Time had started slipping somehow, stretching and folding in ways that made no sense. Kara wasn't sure if it was truly night anymore or just the way this place worked. The ground beneath their boots grew softer, wetter. The air grew colder, filled with the sharp, metallic smell of water and rot. Finally, the river appeared, more of a wide, sluggish stream really, coiling through the dead plain like a black vein. It didn't look like salvation. It looked like something waiting to drown them. Drew hesitated at the edge, staring across the murky water. There should be an old bridge upstream, he said. We can cross there. If it's still standing. Everything out here was an if. They followed the river north, keeping close to the bank. The mud sucked at their boots, making every step harder. Kara's legs ached, her chest burned. She kept her head down, eyes fixed on Drew's back, just trying to keep moving. Trying not to listen too closely to the whispers that slithered between the trees now, laughing in low, broken voices. At one point, Drew stopped so suddenly that Kara almost crashed into him. What? She started, but he silenced her with a look. There, not 20 yards ahead, something moved. At first Kara thought it was just a trick of the light. But then she saw it more clearly, two figures standing at the edge of the river, staring out across the water. They looked human. They didn't move. Didn't speak. Just stood there. Waiting. Kara's heart slammed against her ribs. She grabbed Drew's arm, pulling him back. We go around, she whispered. Drew nodded, face tight. They circled wide, moving as quietly as they could, their boots squelching in the mud. Kara kept her eyes locked on the figures the whole time, half expecting them to turn to come after them. But they didn't. They just kept staring at the water as if they were waiting for something to rise out of it. They found the bridge another half-mile up, a twisted skeleton of rusted metal and splintered wood. Parts of it had collapsed, sagging into the water, but a narrow path still remained across the center. It looked like it could fall apart under their weight at any second. Drew went first, moving slowly, testing each step before shifting his weight. Kara followed, every nerve screaming. The bridge groaned under them but held. Halfway across, Kara dared a glance back toward the riverbank. The two figures were gone. She turned back around quickly, breath catching in her throat. Don't look. Just keep moving. They made it across without falling in, though the bridge shuddered dangerously behind them as they stepped onto solid ground. Kara bent over, hands on her knees, trying to catch her breath. Her whole body was trembling, not from exertion but from the thick, gnawing terror that clung to her like a second skin. Drew put a hand on her shoulder. It was meant to be comforting, but it just made her flinch. Come on, he said softly. We can't stop now. They moved inland, away from the river, into a landscape that felt even worse somehow, an endless forest of dead trees, their branches like broken fingers clawing at the sky. The whispers grew louder here. And now they had words. Kara could almost understand them if she listened too closely. Little snatches of meaning, floating on the wind like poisoned seeds. Come back. You belong here, you were always one of us. She pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block it out, but the words didn't stop. They weren't coming from outside anymore. They were inside her head. Drew stumbled, clutching his temples. It's getting worse, he gasped. I can hear them, inside me. Kara grabbed him, steadied him. She didn't know what else to do. They had to find shelter. Somewhere they could regroup, think. Ahead, through the crooked trees, Kara saw the faint outline of a building. An old house, maybe half collapsed but still standing. It wasn't much. But it was something. She dragged Drew toward it, forcing her legs to keep moving. The house was even worse up close. Walls leaning at impossible angles, roof half gone, windows shattered. But it was shelter. They slipped inside, careful not to disturb the sagging doorframe. The air was stale and bitter, filled with the scent of long-dead things. Kara swept her flashlight around the main room, revealing broken furniture, moldy walls, and deep gouges in the floor like something had tried to claw its way out. Or in. Drew collapsed against the nearest wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the filthy floor. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead. Kara knelt beside him, heart breaking. We're going to make it, she lied, forcing the words out. We just have to keep moving. Find a way out. Drew didn't answer. He just stared at the floor, eyes glassy. Kara turned away, scanning the room again. And that's when she saw it. Carved into the far wall, hidden mostly by shadow, was another message. The other side of us. Her skin crawled. Beneath the words, a crude drawing, a human figure split down the middle. One half normal. The other half, something else. Twisted. Wrong. She reached out and touched the carving with trembling fingers. It was old. Older than the dust and decay in the house. As if it had been waiting here for them. A low noise behind her made her spin around. Drew was standing now, swaying slightly, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. And his eyes weren't right anymore. Not completely. Something was looking out from behind them. Something that wore Drew's face the way a mask wears a smile. Kara, he said, voice too calm, too steady. You don't have to be afraid. She backed away, heart hammering against her ribs. This is who we are, he said. Who we were always meant to be. No, she whispered. No, it's not. He took a step toward her. Kara bolted, crashing through the doorway and into the ruined hallway beyond. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The house seemed to shift around her, walls leaning closer, floors tilting under her feet. She found a back door and burst out into the night, lungs burning, eyes wild. The forest swallowed her whole. Branches tore at her skin. Roots tripped her. The ground itself seemed to hate her. But she didn't stop. Not until she couldn't hear Drew's voice calling after her anymore. Not until the whispers receded back into a low, throbbing hum. She collapsed against a tree, sobbing for breath, tears streaming down her face. She was alone now. Truly alone. But even as she sat there, gasping and shaking, she knew it wasn't over. Something had gotten inside them. Inside her. She could feel it, coiling in the dark corners of her mind. Waiting. Changing her. The other side of her. And somewhere out there Drew was still looking for her. Still waiting. Still calling. Kara wiped her eyes, forcing herself to stand. She had to keep moving. Had to find answers before it was too late. Before she wasn't Kara anymore. Before there was nothing human left to save. The cold silence in the command center stretched so thin it felt like it would snap. Faces once flushed with hope now looked pale under the sharp glow of the overhead lights. Every pair of eyes locked onto the screen, waiting for something, anything, to make sense of what was happening. No one spoke. Even breathing felt too loud. Outside, the winds howled against the battered walls, carrying with them the dust of a world that had already started dying. The sensors picked up movement again, slow at first, almost cautious. The figures approaching were not ones anyone recognized. They moved wrong, like they didn't belong to this world, or any world that made sense to human minds. Jonah pressed his hand against the glass, his breath fogging up the view for a moment. His heart pounded so loud it filled his ears. These things, they weren't part of the war they'd been fighting. They were something else. Something worse. Across the room, Mara gripped the edge of the console, her knuckles white. Why aren't they attacking yet? She whispered, not really expecting an answer. Her voice barely made it over the tense air. Jonah shook his head slowly. Maybe they're waiting for something, he said, his words heavy with dread. The radio crackled to life again, a sharp, broken burst of noise that made everyone jump. A voice came through, distorted and hollow, as if coming from deep underwater. You are seen, it said. You are known. A heavy weight settled on everyone's chest. It wasn't just that they were being hunted. It was worse than that. They were being studied. Jonah slammed his hand against the control panel, frustration and fear boiling over. We need a plan. We can't just sit here waiting to die. Someone muttered agreement. People started moving again, desperate for anything that resembled action. Maps were pulled up, escape routes considered, fallback points drawn out. But deep down, everyone knew they were just buying time. The enemy outside wasn't following rules they understood. The tension twisted tighter when the power flickered, and the screens blinked off for a second too long. In that moment of darkness, the fear turned physical. Every mind raced with images of those shadowed figures pouring into the command center. When the lights sputtered back on, Jonah caught sight of Mara across the room. She looked different now, the usual fire in her eyes replaced with something quieter, heavier. She caught him looking and gave a small, tight nod. Whatever happened next, they were in it together. Then came the thud. 1, 2, 3, heavy blows against the outer wall, deliberate and slow. The whole building shook with the force of it. Dust fell from the ceiling. Somewhere, someone let out a low, terrified whimper. We have to move, Mara said, her voice hard with decision. We're sitting ducks in here. Jonah nodded. Armory first. Then tunnels. The group broke apart, moving quickly but carefully. Every creak of the floor, every echo of a footstep felt amplified 100 times. The building seemed to groan around them like it was alive, aware of the doom closing in. The hallway to the armory was long and exposed, lit by emergency lights that barely held back the creeping darkness. Jonah led the way, rifle clutched tight in his hands, finger hovering near the trigger. He told himself he wouldn't hesitate. Not this time. But as they moved, the air grew colder. Not the cold of broken machines or night winds. This was something deeper, something that reached inside their bones and hollowed them out. The lights overhead flickered again, and in that momentary stutter of vision, Jonah saw shapes move along the edges of the hallway, too fast, too wrong to be human. Mara cursed under her breath. Keep moving, she snapped, and they stumbled forward faster. They reached the armory doors and Jonah punched in the code with shaking fingers. The door clunked open slower than usual, like even the building itself had lost the will to fight. Inside they loaded up quickly. Shotguns, rifles, whatever explosives were left. Jonah's hands moved automatically, but his mind raced with images he couldn't shake. Those things waiting just beyond the walls, studying, learning. The radio crackled again, a soft, almost mocking sound. Another voice closer this time. Running will not save you. Mara grabbed Jonah's shoulder, pulling him back to the present. Tunnels under the west wing. Move. They ran. No more caution now. Survival was a thin thread, fraying with every heartbeat. As they sprinted, the pounding on the walls grew louder, more urgent. Cracks started spiderwebbing across the concrete. Jonah caught a glimpse through a broken window, hundreds of them now, surrounding the building, all moving with a sickening, jerking rhythm. The west wing was a ruin, half collapsed from earlier bombardments. Getting through it was like crawling through the skeleton of a dead giant. Dust choked the air. Metal groaned overhead. Every step felt like it would be their last. Jonah led the way through the rubble, heart hammering. He could hear Mara and the others just behind him, their breaths ragged, their steps uneven. They found the trapdoor hidden beneath a half-fallen wall. Jonah dropped to his knees, fingers scrabbling at the latch. It stuck. Of course it stuck. His hands were slick with sweat and dust. He cursed under his breath, yanking harder. Above them, a long, deep moan echoed through the broken halls. Not human. Not close to it. Finally the door gave. Jonah flung it open and dropped into the darkness below, turning to help the others down. One by one, they disappeared into the blackness, the heavy smell of earth and rust filling their lungs. As Mara dropped down last, Jonah slammed the trapdoor shut. Complete darkness swallowed them. The only sound was the heavy, terrified breathing of the survivors. They fumbled forward, feeling along the walls. The tunnel was narrow and claustrophobic, carved out decades ago as a last resort that no one ever wanted to use. Now it was their only chance. Somewhere above them, something massive hit the building. The ground shook violently, throwing them against the walls. Dirt rained down on their heads. Jonah tasted blood where he bit his tongue. They moved faster, driven by pure terror. But no matter how fast they went, the sounds from above seemed to follow, scraping, pounding, unnatural screeches that didn't belong to anything of earth. Finally, the tunnel opened into a wider space. An old utility room, abandoned and forgotten. They stopped there, gasping for air, checking each other for injuries. Mara leaned against the wall, wiping sweat from her face. She met Jonah's eyes. "They're not just trying to kill us," she said, voice hoarse. "They want something." Jonah felt the truth of it settle deep in his gut. Whatever these things were, they weren't mindless killers. They had a purpose. And somehow humanity was standing in their way. The others sat in a tight circle, rifles pointed toward the dark entrance they'd just come through. No one said it, but they all knew, this room wasn't safe. It was just a pause. A thin breath before the real storm hit. The radio crackled again. But this time it wasn't just a voice. It was laughter. Oh, mocking. Not fully human. Mara clutched the radio, her face twisted in rage and fear. She wanted to throw it against the wall, to scream at the voice taunting them. But she didn't. She set it down carefully, her hands shaking. Jonah took a deep breath. "We hold here. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Outside, in the tunnels, in the ruins above, the enemy moved closer. And this time they weren't just studying. They were hunting. The final confrontation was coming. And the night had never felt longer. "Would you like me to continue directly into the climax next?" The laughter on the radio finally died, but it left a heavy stain in the room, a silence that felt sharper than screams. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. Even the sound of heartbeats seemed to slow, trying not to attract the attention of whatever was out there. Jonah wiped the back of his hand across his mouth, feeling the grit of dust and dried blood. His mind raced, thinking of every possible move they could make. None of them were good. Every tunnel they could run to would still lead back to the same problem. There was no safe place left. Not anymore. Mara crouched by the entrance to the room, her gun resting on her knee, her eyes dark and locked onto the shadows beyond. She didn't look like the fighter Jonah had met at the start of all this. She looked like someone with nothing left to lose, and that scared him more than the things outside. The radio crackled again. A new sound came through. Not laughter this time. It was a voice, but not one that belonged to the enemy. "Help," it whispered. "Weak. Broken. Human." Jonah felt his stomach twist. He looked at Mara and she shook her head slowly, but her face betrayed her. She heard it too. Someone was alive out there. Another voice joined the first, this one stronger. "This is Lieutenant Carson. Is anyone receiving? We need assistance, coordinates." The rest of the message cut off in static. Hope flared sharp and painful in Jonah's chest. Survivors. Maybe even reinforcements. Maybe they weren't alone after all. Mara clenched her jaw. "It's a trick. Has to be. They're trying to lure us out." Jonah wanted to believe she was wrong. He needed to believe it. Because if there really were others out there and they were in trouble, how could they just sit here and let them die? Another voice came through. A child this time. A little girl, sobbing, lost in the static. That broke something in Jonah. He stood up slowly, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "I'm going." Mara caught his arm, her grip iron tight. "You don't even know if it's real." "I can't risk it's not," Jonah said quietly. The others watched, wide-eyed and silent. Fear hung off them in waves. No one wanted to step into that darkness again. No one wanted to admit that whatever humanity they still had left demanded they try. Mara looked into his eyes for a long moment, searching for something, maybe strength, maybe foolishness. Finally she nodded once. "You're not going alone." They moved together, quiet and fast. Jonah led the way back into the tunnels, the others close behind, every nerve screaming in protest. Every step felt like walking deeper into the mouth of some vast, unseen beast. The further they went, the colder it got. The walls started to pulse with a faint glow, almost like veins running through a living thing. Jonah tried not to look too closely. Tried not to think about what that meant. They followed the voices, weak and broken, guiding them like lights through a fog. But the closer they got, the less human the voices sounded. Words slipped into strange, broken patterns. Cries turned into something else, something almost musical but wrong. Mara hissed, "This isn't right." Jonah kept moving. He had to know. The tunnel opened suddenly into a vast underground chamber, so massive it swallowed their flashlight beams whole. And there, in the center of it, was the second shock that broke Jonah's mind clean open. Humans. Rows of them. Standing. Eyes open. But unmoving. Frozen like statues. The air was thick with the smell of earth and something sharper, metallic. The figures were covered in fine strands of something like spider silk, connecting them to the walls, to the ceiling, to each other. It wasn't a rescue. It was a harvest. Mara stumbled back, hand over her mouth. "Oh God, they're still alive." Jonah moved closer, his stomach turning with every step. He could see their chests rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths. Their eyes moved slightly, tracking him, pleading silently. Trap. A living web. The radio on Jonah's hip crackled again and he jumped, heart hammering. The same child's voice, soft and sad. "Don't leave us." It wasn't coming from the trapped people. It was coming from the walls. Mara's face drained of color. "They're copying us." Jonah spun, looking around wildly. In the shadows of the chamber, more shapes moved, smooth and wrong, half-formed like clay figures trying to remember how to be human. The enemy wasn't just hunting them. It was learning them. Mimicking. Becoming. The survivors weren't prisoners for ransom or punishment. They were templates. Blueprints. Jonah's head pounded. Everything felt too big, too impossible. His fingers tightened around his rifle, though he knew it wouldn't save them. From the far side of the chamber, something larger stirred. A mass of shadows, shifting and coiling like smoke given weight. It wasn't fully formed yet. Parts of it were human-shaped. Other parts weren't. Mara grabbed his sleeve. "We need to go. Now." But Jonah couldn't move. His eyes were locked on one of the captured humans, a woman whose face looked so familiar it made his knees buckle. It was Sarah. His sister. The sister he thought had died months ago when the outpost fell. She blinked at him, a slow tear sliding down her cheek. "Jonah?" she whispered. The creature in the shadows stirred again, faster now, sensing them, tasting the disruption. Mara yanked him back hard. "Move, Jonah." Tearing his eyes away, he stumbled after her. The others followed, terror giving them wings. They sprinted back through the tunnels, hearts beating against their ribs like war drums. But the tunnels weren't the same anymore. The walls pulsed and shifted, narrowing, growing slick with something that wasn't quite moisture. The air stank of rot and fear. Behind them the footsteps came. Fast. Too fast. Jonah pushed himself harder, lungs burning, legs screaming. He didn't dare look back. The tunnels forked ahead. Mara shouted, pointing. Jonah veered left with her, trusting her instincts. The others followed blindly. But the tunnels weren't leading back to the safe house. They were leading down. Deeper. Jonah realized too late that the ground sloped under their feet, drawing them further into the creature's domain. The radio crackled again. This time it was his own voice that came through, distorted and mocking. "Jonah, you can't run." The walls tightened around them. Ahead, the tunnel opened into another vast space. Jonah skidded to a stop, heart freezing. It wasn't another chamber. It was a nest. Pulsing sacs hung from the ceiling, dimly glowing. Figures moved inside them, shadows writhing and growing. Every one of them human-shaped. Every one of them incomplete. They hadn't just copied the survivors. They were making more. Clones. Replicas. A new army. Jonah stumbled back, crashing into Mara. "What do we do?" she whispered, voice shaking. Before he could answer, the ground under their feet cracked open, and they fell into the dark. The fall seemed endless. Jonah's arms flailed in the darkness, reaching for anything, but the air swallowed him whole. Then the ground hit him hard, knocking the breath from his chest. He lay there for a moment, stunned, the world spinning. Dim lights flickered above, but they weren't lights at all. They were sacs, more of them, stretching up into a ceiling so high it disappeared into black. Mara landed nearby with a grunt, followed by the others. They groaned and scrambled to their feet, battered but alive. Jonah's ribs ached with every breath, but he forced himself up, adrenaline pushing him through the pain. The ground here wasn't solid. It pulsed under his boots, alive and warm, like the inside of some vast creature. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. Around them the walls curved inward, slick and breathing. A low hum filled the air, growing louder. Jonah turned and saw them, the creatures. Not unfinished now. They had faces. Human faces. Faces Jonah knew. His own. Copies of him, dozens of them, stepping out from the shadows, their eyes empty, mouths slack. They moved in jerky, unnatural motions, but there was no mistaking it. They were him. Mara fired first, her weapon flashing bright. Two of the things dropped, but three more took their place. The others opened fire too, the small cavern erupting in chaos and echoes, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with bare hands. Jonah grabbed Mara's arm and pulled her toward a narrow gap in the wall. They squeezed through, the others behind them, and stumbled into another chamber. This one was different. In the center of the room there was a shape, a machine or something like it. It throbbed with a deep blue light, casting long, trembling shadows. And strapped to its base was something that made Jonah's heart tear itself apart. Sarah. Not the frozen version from before, not a copy. The real one. Weak, thin, but unmistakably alive. She lifted her head weakly, her eyes meeting Jonah's, full of pain and a fierce, stubborn hope. Tubes and strands of that living web fed into her skin, connecting her to the machine. Mara cursed under her breath. They're using her. Jonah didn't need her to explain. He understood now. Sarah wasn't just trapped. She was the source. Somehow the enemy was pulling from her, memories, emotions, her very essence, to create these twisted versions. She was the template for everything. Without thinking, Jonah sprinted toward her. The creatures behind them shrieked, the sound scraping the inside of his skull, but he didn't stop. Bullets whizzed past him as Mara and the others covered him, buying precious seconds. Jonah reached Sarah's side and fumbled at the restraints. They were strange, half-organic cables that pulsed under his fingers. He pulled, twisted, ripped. The cables fought him, wrapping around his wrists like living snakes. Sarah whispered, "Don't, it'll kill you." Jonah gritted his teeth. "I'm not leaving you." He yanked harder, feeling the cables slicing into his skin, drawing blood. Pain blinded him, but he didn't let go. Finally, with a sickening snap, the main cable tore free. Sarah gasped, collapsing against him. The machine shuddered, the blue light flickering violently. The copies screamed in unison, a terrible, echoing wail. The entire nest began to quake. Cracks split the walls and floor, black ichor pouring out. The sacks overhead burst, spilling half-formed shapes that writhed and shriveled on the ground. Jonah grabbed Sarah and hoisted her onto his back. "Go," he shouted. They ran, the tunnel collapsing behind them. The ground tilted, sliding them downward, but Jonah didn't stop moving. Mara and the others pushed forward too, their faces grim and desperate. The exit was ahead. A thin shaft of daylight pierced the gloom, so bright it hurt to look at. They burst through the gap just as the ground behind them caved in with a roar, swallowing the nest whole. Outside, the world was still broken, ruined buildings, gray skies, but the air was clean. Free. Jonah collapsed to his knees, Sarah trembling in his arms. Mara fell beside him, laughing breathlessly, half in relief and half in disbelief. They had made it. For a moment, there was nothing but silence and the ragged sound of breathing. Jonah looked at Sarah, brushing hair from her face. She smiled weakly, her fingers tightening around his. But something in her eyes made his stomach twist. It was wrong. Too calm. Too empty. Sarah's smile widened slowly, too wide, and in a voice that was almost hers but not quite, she whispered, "Thank you for bringing me out." Jonah's heart stopped. Mara caught it too. She scrambled back, gun raised, her face pale. The real Sarah, the one he had seen trapped, fighting, was gone. This was something else. A perfect copy. They hadn't saved her. They had set it free. The realization hit Jonah like a punch to the chest. The creature looked up at the ruined world around it, breathing in, almost savoring it. Then it smiled again, a terrible, knowing smile. And in the distance, deep in the ruins, other voices began to call out. Familiar ones. New ones. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. Jonah stumbled back, his body frozen, his mind refusing to believe what he was seeing. He had fought so hard to save her, pushed through every nightmare, only to find out that the nightmare had followed them out. The creature, whatever it truly was, tilted its head, studying him like a child might study. An ant on the ground. It didn't move to attack. It didn't need to. It had already won in its own way. The wind howled across the broken city, tossing dust into the air. Mara's hands shook where she held her weapon trained on the thing wearing Sarah's face. The others stood behind them, silent, their faces pale and hollow-eyed. No one spoke. No one knew what to do. Jonah felt it first, a low vibration under his boots like the city itself was trembling. The calls in the distance grew louder, closer, a chorus of broken voices crawling through the ruins. Jonah knew what they were. More copies. More lies. They had unleashed something and it was multiplying fast. The fake Sarah took a slow step forward. Mara tensed, her finger tightening on the trigger. "No," Jonah said quietly, putting a hand on her arm. His voice was hoarse, raw. "Shooting it won't change anything." Mara's eyes darted to his, full of fear and rage, but she lowered the gun a fraction. The creature stopped just a few feet away from Jonah. It smiled again, but this time there was something almost sad about it. As if it knew this wasn't the way things were supposed to go, but it didn't care anymore. It reached out one hand, palm up, inviting. Jonah stared at it, at the imitation of everything he had loved and lost, and made a choice. He stepped back. The creature's face flickered for a moment, the smile twitching into something less certain, less human. It didn't understand rejection. It wasn't built for that. It had assumed it could replace what had been taken. But Jonah wasn't looking for a replacement. He never had been. He turned his back on it. "Come on," he said to the others. His voice was steadier now. "We have to move." Mara hesitated, but then she nodded, signaling the others. They followed Jonah into the ruins, leaving the thing behind them. The world they stepped into was broken beyond recognition. Buildings lay in shattered heaps, cars rusted into the earth, and the sky was a sickly gray. But for the first time in a long time, Jonah felt a strange kind of hope. Not because they had won. They hadn't. Not yet. But because they were still here. Still fighting. They found shelter in the remains of an old subway station, hidden beneath layers of debris. The tunnels were dark and cold, but safe for now. Jonah sat with his back against the wall, the cold seeping into his bones, and stared at the flickering light of a salvaged lamp. Mara sat across from him, cleaning her weapon with slow, mechanical motions. The others tended to wounds or scouted the nearby tunnels. No one spoke much. They didn't need to. The weight of what had happened pressed down on all of them. After a while Mara looked up. "You think it'll find us?" Jonah didn't answer right away. He thought about the fake Sarah's face, the way it had almost looked regretful. Maybe it would come after them. Maybe it wouldn't. Maybe it had bigger plans now. "It might," he said finally. "But we'll be ready." Mara nodded, accepting that simple truth. Days passed in a blur. They scavenged for food and supplies, moving carefully, avoiding the growing groups of copies that roamed the ruins. They were spreading fast, claiming territory, building something. No one knew what. No one wanted to find out. Jonah spent his nights staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of movement, wondering if the real Sarah was out there somewhere. Maybe she had been gone a long time. Maybe she had never really been alive after the nest had taken her. The thought hurt like nothing else. But he didn't push it away. He held on to it. The pain reminded him that she had mattered. That what they were fighting for still mattered. One night, while the others slept, Jonah sat alone at the mouth of the tunnel, watching the city. Fires burned in the distance, shadows moving through the smoke. The wind carried whispers he couldn't quite understand. Maybe they weren't meant to be understood. Mara joined him after a while, sitting down beside him without a word. They watched together in silence. After a long time Mara said, "We could leave. Find somewhere farther out. Start over." Jonah thought about it. Leaving the ruins behind, the memories, the monsters. Finding some patch of earth where the sky was clear and the ground didn't bleed under your feet. He wanted it. God, he wanted it. But he shook his head. "If we run, they'll just follow," he said. "We have to stand." Mara didn't argue. She just sat there, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders against the cold. Jonah turned his gaze back to the city. The fake Sarah might have fooled them once, but not again. They knew what they were up against now. And he wasn't about to let the world be swallowed by copies of a broken memory. He wasn't about to let humanity fade into something less than real. They started organizing. Other survivors heard the rumors of a group still fighting, still resisting. They came out of hiding, drawn by hope or desperation or both. Jonah and Mara taught them what they knew. How to recognize the fakes. How to move quietly. How to survive. Slowly, painfully they built something. A small, stubborn ember in the ruins. One day, as Jonah was patching up a radio transmitter they had salvaged, he caught a signal. Static at first. Then a voice, faint but clear. Other side, still fighting. He froze, heart pounding. He turned the dial carefully, fine-tuning the signal. "If you can hear this, you're not alone. We're alive. We're fighting back. Hold the line. Hold the line." The voice was rough, tired, but alive. And it wasn't a copy. Jonah could feel it in his bones. He looked up at Mara, who was already grinning, the first real smile he'd seen from her in weeks. They weren't alone. There were others. The world wasn't gone yet. The fake Sarah and the creatures that followed her would keep coming, and the fight ahead would be brutal. But now they knew they weren't just surviving. They were building something new. Something human. Jonah stood at the entrance of the subway station, the ruined city stretching out before him. The cold wind whipped around him, carrying the scent of ash and metal and something else, hope. He tightened his grip on the worn strap of his rifle and started walking toward the rising sun. Behind him, Mara and the others followed. They didn't know what the future held. They didn't know if they would win. But they knew who they were. They were the last line. The real ones. And they wouldn't let the other side win. No matter what it took. The end. If you made it this far, thank you for being part of the journey. The other side of us is more than just a story about survival. It's a reminder of what makes us human. It's about memory, hope, and the choices we make even when everything seems lost. If you felt something while listening, if even for a second you saw yourself in these characters, then this story did what it was meant to do. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you want more stories that dive deep into the heart of what it means to be human. And remember, no matter how dark the world gets, there's always someone still fighting. Maybe that's you. Stay strong. Stay real. And I'll see you in the next story.